Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming. So, I entered into a devotion to St. Catherine recently when I submitted a book manuscript for publication. We all know how ruthless some peer reviewers can be, so naturally I wondered who was the patron saint of philosophers, and it turns out it is St. Catherine of Alexandria. But as I read more and more about her, I discovered something disturbing. Many contemporary scholars doubted her existence, and she, along with many other saints, were actually removed from the liturgical calendar in the 1960s, go figure, only to be incorporated back in as an optional feast by St. John Paul II. The more I read, the more concerned I was at the methodology these scholars employed. And the more I learned about St. Catherine, the more I realized how utterly relevant she is to the philosophy of technology, both in terms of exemplary technology, which I consider tools and tool use, and technology as an ontological condition in the Heideggerian sense. So with that background, I'd like to share a bit about St. Catherine and why I think the study of her passion and its historical treatment is so incredibly important. We are told that St. Catherine was born in the second half of the 3rd century in Alexandria, Egypt, and appears to have been martyred at the start of the 4th century, circa 305 AD. She was from a noble family and, although apparently orphaned while still quite young, maintained her estate and became very well educated. She has been known since antiquity for her astounding beauty and brilliance of mind, but most importantly for her modesty and devotion to Christianity. The story of her conversion goes like this. One day, while she was reading in the library, she fell asleep and had a dream. In the dream, a magnanimous woman came to her holding a small child and asked the child, "How about her? Would you like to marry her?" The child responded, "No, she is ugly." Catherine awoke from the dream very upset. Why would the child call her, a beautiful young lady, ugly? When she asked the librarian, he recognized that in the dream, the lady was the Blessed Virgin herself and the child of Christ. He told her that Christ had found her ugly because she was a pagan, and Catherine converted on the spot and devoted herself entirely to Christianity. The next time in the library, she fell asleep and had a similar dream. Mary again approached with Christ and asked, "How about her? Would you like to marry her?" He responded, "Yes, she is beautiful." From that day forth, she considered herself married to Christ. As the legend of her passion informs us, one day the Emperor Maximin was holding a festival, and part of the festivities involved the slaughtering of bulls and other animals as a sacrifice to various pagan gods. Sounds so awful and the whole scene so deplorable that Catherine stormed into the center of the festival and chastised Maximin in front of everyone, penetratingly advocating for the truth of Christ and proclaiming that all of Maximin's gods were false. It was a brilliant and compelling speech, so instead of killing Catherine on the spot, since Maximin was indeed impressed by her beauty and brilliance of mind, he summoned the 50 best philosophical minds in the country to come refute her. Catherine awaited the confrontation while in prison, and an angel visited her and promised that God would help her to victory. When the day came, rather than refuting Catherine, she convinced all of the philosophers of the truth of Christ, and they immediately converted to Christianity. Maximin responded to this by having the philosophers burned at the stake. Since Maximin thus realized he clearly could not convert Catherine, he decided he would try and seduce her. She obviously rejected his advances, so Maximin had her tortured and thrown back into prison to starve to death. Throughout the torture, she showed no outward signs of pain, and her wounds were miraculously healed while in jail. She was also kept alive in prison by manna from heaven given to her by a miraculous dove. At some point, even the queen and the captain of the guard visited Catherine in her cell, and both converted to Christianity, along with 200 of the guard's soldiers. After some time, when Catherine was brought again before Maximin, he was curious why she wasn't dead yet, she eloquently reiterated her defense of Christianity, which infuriated him. One of his men, Crises, decided to design a wheel of death to kill her. It was a horrendous construction with various blades meant to rip St. Catherine apart. However, just as she was put on the wheel, angels came down and the device shattered into small fragments, shooting out and killing many of the pagans that had attended to watch her die. Maximin grew further enraged, and the empress, now a Christian, decided to intervene on Catherine's behalf, at which point Maximin had her tortured and killed by equally horrendous means. I'll spare you the gruesome details. In the face of all this torture, the emperor's chief guard nevertheless came forward and professed his own conversion along with his 200 soldiers, and Maximin had all of them executed on the spot. In the end, Maximin decided to have Catherine beheaded, to which she readily agreed, but she first requested two things from God. First, that her body would not be divided into relics, and second, that anyone seeking assistance from God in her name should have their prayers answered. She was thus beheaded, but milk sprung from her neck instead of blood, and angels then took her body to Mount Sinai, where today there is an extremely old monastery in her honor. Now, many scholars think the story I just recounted is entirely fabricated. In the most generous treatment, St. Catherine is seen as the assemblage of various persecution stories from the 4th century, crystallized around an ideal character sometime in the 8th century. The most severe treatments claim the story was appropriated from the 5th century pagan Hypatia, who was tortured and killed by Christians in Alexandria, so essentially a total reversal of the tale. Before we glance at some of the actual arguments against the existence of St. Catherine, I'd like to talk a bit about what I call the hermeneutic of doubt, because I believe the scholarly treatments of St. Catherine largely operate upon this basis. So what is this basis? What is its origin? Doubt is not always a bad thing, and of course it plays an essential role in the basic distinction in philosophy between appearance and reality. But in the modern world, beginning particularly with Descartes, doubt assumes a more hideous form. Descartes is, of course, known for his statement, Je pense donc je suis, which he later translated into Latin with the infamous cogito ergo sum. While every first-year philosophy student is likely familiar with this, what they might miss is that the cogito ergo sum is entirely predicated upon dubito, in the sense of dubito ergo cogito ergo sum. I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am, which is exactly how Descartes phrases it in later works. What is this doubt doubting? Well, everything, essentially, but I think it is most helpful to juxtapose Descartes' doubt with the Fides of St. Thomas, whose philosophical system was not based upon doubt, but instead faith, not as mere credulity, but fides in the sense of a more certain knowledge accessed via revelation. And this fides is then rearticulated by reason, for example, with the idea of quod sit per se necessarium, that which is necessary in itself or necessary being. These are two fundamentally different approaches to the world, one being predicated upon God or ultimate being, and the other man. On the one hand, St. Thomas was utterly certain of the reality of an all-encompassing being, and this knowledge formed the basis for all hermeneutic encounters with reality. On the other hand, Descartes' methodology supplants God as first principle with the doubting subject. Thus, it is man himself, as doubter of even necessary being, that forms the new basis for engagement with the world. Of course, Descartes wasn't all bad, but he sowed a rather nasty seed. Indeed, with Marx, the very same suspicious methodology assumes a truly hideous form, capable of essentially devouring all things. The critical difference is that Marx's methodological postulate of dialectical or historical materialism is utterly unphilosophical. It is a radically deontological position that rejects the existence of anything beyond our historical exchange in an ever-shifting material world. There is nothing transcendental, no ultimate source of values, no immaterial beings, no universals, no soul, no being, no God, nothing. As a methodological postulate in the humanities, all evidence is thus filtered through one particular lens, namely the struggles between oppressor and oppressed that emerge from commodities, which everything is reducible to. The results of this approach can be convincing and indeed enlightening in some cases, but they just as easily lead to outrageous conclusions. For instance, in my other work, I argue against a school of Marxians who advocate that the idea of a unitary, bounded inner self-consciousness is really just an illusion stemming from the introjection of the value of coined money into the brain. And self-consciousness is really false consciousness, a belief held by Marx. And despite how ridiculous it sounds, their arguments are incredibly sophisticated and compelling, even if they are counterintuitive at first glance. Indeed, there are some corollaries with Heidegger's notion of Gestalt. In any case, when we employ this methodology, one that forcefully doubts even the existence of the static inner self, it would seem that poor St. Catherine stands no chance. First of all, there is no concrete evidence naming Catherine before the 8th century, and this lack of evidence is used as positive evidence for the Marxians to refute her existence. A classic move that I have observed on numerous occasions in the realm of pre-Socratic philosophy. Stories of St. Catherine also contain common hagiographic characteristics that apply to many of the virgin martyrs. They're young, pure, beheaded for their allegiance to Christ, etc. There is and can be no proof of the existence of angels, immaterial beings, within the horizon of historical materialism, so clearly they could not have intervened to help her, since they do not really exist. And likewise, milk did not pour out from Catherine's neck once she was beheaded, because that isn't what happens when you chop off someone's head. The healing of her wounds and nourishment from divine manna are also ridiculous fantasies. As one scholar puts it, quote, the tale contains elements which owe more to myth than history. For example, angelic intervention to destroy the wheel and later carry Catherine's body away for burial. None of the supposedly historical detail in the Passio can be corroborated, and much of the information can be shown to be no more than hagiographic stereotypes, end quote. Such accounts are then essentially reduced to power struggles a la Marx. Quote, these later vitae were normally written for the purpose of proving the sanctity of the individuals concerned, end quote. In other words, they were made up to give some legitimacy to the claim for historical reality and some sort of medieval power play by the church, presumably because a cult following would lose power and influence if its foundation narrative were false. Indeed, the idea that Catherine asked for her body not to be divided into relics was the perfect cover for why none of her relics existed. It was surely a later interpolation into the tale to make up for the lack of a body. So many problematic elements to St. Catherine's tale, no reasonable person would suggest she was real. And yet, there is an interesting account from Eusebius, a contemporary of Catherine, who's writing his ecclesiastical history in Palestine, that mentions a young, beautiful, smart, and most importantly, modest Christian lady from Alexandria, she's otherwise unnamed, to whom the lustful Maximin was unable to lay claim because of her brave spirit. Eusebius' account even talks about the fact that this woman was willing to die, but here Maximin couldn't bring himself to do it, eventually having her exiled rather than beheaded. Tale ends with Maximin torturing and killing a great many Christians using a wheel or rack. With that historical tidbit in mind, I'd like to open up another avenue for analysis of St. Catherine. In his discussion of hermeneutics, Gadamer commented that in our approach to documents, we need to adopt either a position of faith or suspicion clearly winning out these days, in classics at least. Pope Benedict thus advocated for hermeneutics of faith when he recognized the alternative, quote, where the hermeneutics of faith disappear, another type of hermeneutics will appear by necessity, a hermeneutics that is secularist, positivist, the key fundamental of which is the conviction that the divine does not appear in human history, end quote. So, if we assume a hermeneutic of Fides when considering St. Catherine, why wouldn't there be contemporary accounts of her passion, since it was clearly a very public event? The answer seems quite obvious to me. Pagans were burning Christians at the stake and chopping people's heads off, so writing down and transmitting accounts would have gotten one in serious trouble. Today, I'm afraid to even say if I'm an undecided voter, and we've yet to see any beheadings. And for that matter, just because the earliest extant manuscript is from the 8th century doesn't preclude that it reflects an earlier tradition. In fact, most certainly does. Our very earliest manuscript is a Latin translation of an index entry from a now lost Greek original. How old was that Greek tradition? Potentially reaching back to a first-hand account of the events themselves. Indeed, the earliest 8th century Greek manuscripts detailing the Passion mention a certain Anastasius, who's allegedly responsible for the story. This Anastasius has been identified by some of the faithful as Saint Anastasius, also of Alexandria, who would have been about 9 years old when Catherine was executed. And while the Marxists will dismiss this as an element added to give authority to her cult in the church, we clearly have a plausible witness and solid rationale for why there are no immediately contemporaneous accounts. The story could have easily been tucked away in the memory of a child, not written down or even spoken about until long after the events. Admittedly, this is a judgment based on Fides, but it's certainly not unreasonable. So why should the hermeneutic of doubt get preference when examining St. Catherine or in the humanities in general? Does it offer us something more reliable or real? Emphasis on the methodological postulate is indeed beneficial for science, perhaps even social science, but extended to the humanities in such a way that it operates as the only hermeneutical framework borders on academic dishonesty, because such a methodology is founded upon the false presupposition of the explanatory reliability of historical materialism for all things. Ultimately, Marxians tacitly assume that if we cannot prove the existence of St. Catherine, she likely is not real, and I find that disingenuous. In any case, now that I have convinced you all that St. Catherine was undoubtedly real, I'd like to talk briefly about the importance of her passion and its historical treatment in relation to the philosophy of technology. As I mentioned in the opening of this talk, there are two forms of technology that are relevant to St. Catherine, what I call exemplary technology, consisting of tools and tool use, and technology as an ontological condition. In the case of exemplary technology, Catherine's wheel was designed for one purpose: to kill a person in as torturous a way as possible. It was a large wooden wheel with various razor-sharp blades pointing in different directions. And when the victim was strapped in, it would operate much like a meat grinder, tearing the persons to bits as they were stretched out. St. Catherine's response to this hideous creation was complete and utter Fides. And it was such a tremendous faith that it flowed from her and extended to the empress, chief guard, and hundreds of other people, perhaps even the young Anastasius. And just as Catherine's unshakable Fides in the face of such evil technology inspired the people around her, so today the philosopher of technology will be wise to allow it to influence him in the face of unprecedented exemplary technological innovation, albeit now of a different pleasure-centered sort, which might be even more threatening to human authenticity. Because ultimately, when all is said and done, one thing is certain, to me at least: creating more exemplary technologies can certainly help people in some instances, but in the final analysis, such technologies will not solve the problem of relentless technological oppressions and upheavals, because they cannot resolve the underlying ontological condition. Only Fides can. So we turn to what I see as the more pressing issue. How does St. Catherine's Fides also help us overcome technology as an ontological condition? Heidegger, who characterized technology in this way, largely responding to Descartes' metaphysical appropriation of the world. In his introduction to what is metaphysics, he tells the story of Descartes, his translator Picot, to whom Descartes described all of philosophy as a tree: the roots metaphysics, the trunk physics, the branches, the various sciences. Heidegger saw a fundamental problem with this account, insofar as metaphysics sees beings as beings and confuses the totality of beings for being itself. He therefore asked, what is the soil from which the tree emerges? Heidegger, it was, quote, being as such in its totality and its difference from beings in the totality of beings, end quote. And that's borrowing from the late Father William J. Richardson. This Cartesian metaphysical appropriation of the world is conflated with technology and the technological framing that occurs when we forget about the legitimacy of the question of the meaning of being. Hence, we arrive at calculative thought, a type of thought that operates, as Heidegger puts it, on the basis of the denial of the question worthiness of being. It is schematic precisely because it is blinded to certain fundamental truths. Blinded to being as such, it still participates in the revelation of beings in the manner of framing. The Emperor Maximin is truly an excellent example of such calculative thought. No matter what happens or what he witnesses, he is unwilling and seemingly unable to change his viewpoint. He is stuck in the cave, so to speak. When Catherine presents a totally convincing argument, rather than recognizing the truth, Maximin summons philosophers to disprove her. When they utterly fail and instead convert, rather than see he was mistaken, he has Catherine tortured and burns all the philosophers at the stake. He is unfazed when Catherine's wounds are miraculously healed, and unfazed when she remains miraculously nourished in prison. He can't see the larger truth because he is trapped in what Heidegger would describe as a devastating ontological condition of full technological appropriation of the world. Thus, Maximin agrees with Chrysostom and develops the most heinous technological device conceivable. When the angels destroy the device and kill hundreds of people in the process, still unfazed. He remains unfazed even when his own wife converts to Christianity and intervenes on Catherine's behalf. And in the end, even when Catherine exhibits an astounding level of faith and agrees to be beheaded, he remains unfazed and proceeds with the act. It is precisely this inability to see what is plainly obvious and all around that characterizes the problem of technology. We see beings and forget that they are illuminated by the light of being in the very same way that Maximin can't see the miracles taking place before his eyes, and much like the prisoners in the cave would not listen to the freedman. Ultimately, then, it seems that the tale of St. Catherine of Alexandria and its modern historical treatment provide a powerful message about technology that we should probably pay attention to. It teaches us about the scotomatic thinking exhibited in calculative thought, and it shows us the terrible results of that type of thinking. It also shows us that such thinking can imagine horrible devices and bring them to fruition. And indeed, examining the contemporary hermeneutical framework that engages with the tradition of St. Catherine indicates the type of thinking Maximin employs is the very same type of thinking employed in the critical methodology, thinking operating on the basis of doubt about the very truth of being. St. Catherine's passion provides so much more than a mere warning about the dangers of technology and the technological mindset then and now. Her story shows us that, as horrendous as calculative thinking is and as heinous as the devices may become, they're all easily vanquished by the power of Fides. It is Fides in the legitimacy of the question of the meaning of being, Fides in the incommensurability of the principle of self-consciousness to the physical brain, Fides in something transcending the methodological postulate of historical materialism, and all of this is tantamount to what my friend Father Joe might call Fides in the all-encompassing bosom of being. Ultimately, the beauty of St. Catherine's passion gives us a new way forward, not simply swapping cogito ergo sum with the earlier quod sit per se necessarium, but instead we can formulate a new Catholic first principle that captures mankind as existing in the omnipresent field of the beauty of being, namely fide ergo sumus, principle with which we can confront any form of technology.